Having done the trip on the Outback with Centrillion in 1974, when they went broke and we saw nothing, we'd made a decision that next time we would do that, we would do it by ourselves. Having bought the four-wheel drive Suzuki about 2 years before, it was well set up and ready to go for this trip. The route we would take was to head west from Melbourne, heading towards South Australia. On the border, a place called Uluru, we turned north and went north up to Burra. From Burra we went to Wilpena Pound, and from Wilpena Pound up to Maree, up to Birdsville, from Birdsville up to Mount Isa. From then we headed west again across the Tennant Creek, from there down to Alice Springs, and from there out to Kings Canyon, down to Ayers Rock, out to the Ulgus, then heading south again, down to Coober Pedy, and back in through Port Augusta, back into Adelaide, and back to Melbourne. On the second day of the trip, we got to Luxton, which is on the Murray, and we had a nice break here for lunch. Later we got to Morgan. The Murray is quite wide, and there's ferries are running across there. Heading north, went along the plains, heading towards Burra and Peterborough. Soon we reached Wilpena Pound and camped there for the night. We happened to meet a couple of young guys there from Victoria as well, and they were looking for somewhere to go. And we were looking for company to take us up over the Birdsville Track, so they said, hey, we'll go with you. So Mike and Kevin joined us for the rest of the trip. As you exit Maree, as you go into the Birdsville Track, you're given pretty serious warnings. We'd already registered with the police, and we're ready to go on our road. That first evening, we made it quite a way up the track. It was in pretty good order at this stage. What we weren't really aware of was the fact that there was a detour in the track because of the water coming down Cooper's Creek, and that we had to do about a 60-kilometre detour to get there. However, we got to Cooper's Creek just on sundown, and we camped just off the road next to where a ferry was running. Being a highway, it had to be kept open. Some of the support bars on Mike's roof rack didn't like the corrugations, so we had to fix them up at night. Early next morning, the bird life awoke us very early. With the river being the way it is, a lot of fish in it, a lot of good times for the birds. These were pelicans. After having a chat to the guys operating the ferry, we crossed across to the northern side. There ain't a lot to see out there for a while. Just to give a stone. Soon we reached Merrimetta Bore, which is basically the halfway point of this crossing. But it was so hot that we had to get back inside the car to take the photographs. Because of the detour, we used up a lot more fuel than we had expected. So at 80k out, we had to resort to filling up the cars from the jerry cans. And a couple of hours later, we arrived at the Birdsville pub. We got some rain while we were there, which is quite unusual. This is the remains, I think, of the old nursing home, the original ones in the area. This was actually New Year's Eve we arrived, so there were quite a few people in town that night. We spent the night in the caravan park, quote unquote. Next day we headed north. The policeman Gordon from Birdsville was supposed to be going to dinner at one of the stations, but he couldn't make it, so he asked us if we could drop a letter in. It's only 170 kilometres up the road. But we started to hear some knocking from the suspension, and when we looked down, found one of the brackets had broken, so we just had to take it a bit easy. starting to get a little concerned because this tropical storm was coming across, and we had to cross from some rivers before we could get to Boulia for the night. But we rested. It went completely black and you couldn't see the track anymore because of the water over it with the storm. However, we arrived in Boulia late at night and we're too lazy to really put the tent up properly, so we just put it between the two cars. We had a late start the next morning, just as a way of recovering from the very long day the day before. By mid-afternoon, we could start to see ourselves getting closer to Mount Isa. The next morning we found a little engineering shop was open and he fixed us up with new brackets for the suspension. From now on we were heading west towards Tennant Creek. This is crossing the border between Queensland and the Northern Territory. We spent the night in a place called Three Ways just north of Tennant Creek, and then we headed south towards Alice. And just south of Tennant Creek are the Devil's Marbles. Coming down to Burrow Creek, we saw the old telegraph station there, and unfortunately some of the operators there had been killed by some of the Aboriginals. In Alice Springs, we had a good look around the old telegraph station, which is really nicely set up now for tourists, showing them what it was like in times gone by. Alice Springs itself is not really it's not a big town, but a very pleasant town. This is looking south towards Heavy Tree Gap, where we were to camp. There's some great canyons all around the Alice Springs area, well worth having a trip around them. We went out to visit the memorial and the grave of Flynn, who started the Royal Flying Doctor Service. The stone on top of the grave was actually one of the Devil's Marbles and has since been returned back up to its home. We also stopped in at Pitchy Ritchie to have a look at some of the fantastic sculpture. Leaving Alice, we head south down the highway and we come to the bridge over the River Fink. Now this photograph had been taken on the Centrillion tour about 3 years before, and you can see the monument to the new bridge, and up the top of one of the black girders you'll see a little white band. That was a record of the highest flood. When we arrived here in '77, this is what we found. Leaving Alice Springs as well, we also had met up with a couple of Western Australians. I call them Crazy Dave. So he decided to join us out to Kings Canyon, and from Kings Canyon down to look at Ayers Rock and the Olgas. Not much around Kings Canyon in those days. Nowadays it's a motel and a complete tourist center. Can't believe it. We arrived down at Ayers Rock, or Uluru, in the middle of a dust storm. The next day we drove around it, had a good look, and also climbed it, which today is a little bit politically incorrect, but in those days it was quite accepted. Because of the dust storm while we were there, we didn't get many good photographs of the actual rocks. So I actually bought a couple to show the variation in the colour, depending on the sun and the time of day. We also drove out to the Olgas. They're only 30 kilometres to the west. Well worth the visit. Heading down south again, we go past Mount Connor and keep heading south towards the South Australian border. Next couple of days we arrived at Coober Pedy. We stopped there for a couple of nights, and the actual camping grounds underground. Another 2 days of driving, found us at Port Augusta. From there, it's another day's trip down to Adelaide, and then we spent another 2 days going from Adelaide back to Melbourne. Well, a great trip.